Welcome to this New York City 9/11 memorial event, sponsored by the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. My name is David Meiswinkle, and I'm the president. The program will be divided into two parts. The first part will be very solemn. The Reverend Audette Fulbright will read an invocation to us, and Fire Commissioner Christopher Gioia of Franklin Square, Munson, will begin a roll call of the victims of 9/11, first responders in New York City. The roll call will consist of Christopher Gioia, Ross Muir from the Truth Action Project, and myself. On 9/11, 412 first responders in New York City died. 343 of them were firemen, 23 New York City police officers, 37 Port Authority of New York and New Jersey officers, 8 EMT personnel, and 1 officer in a fireboat. 412 valiant heroes lost everything. So today we honor them and we honor their families with a roll call. To begin the program off, we do so with a prayer.
Good afternoon. I'm Reverend Audette Fulbright, and on behalf of the All Souls community, I want to welcome you here today and just say, I know you have a long afternoon in front of you, but I do want to say that having served in this community, I know that I frequently hear from our members and friends how grateful they are for the care and concern and the lives of our first responders. So we join you in spirit today and are grateful that we take this time for memorialization. So I want to ask, if you will now, just to take a moment to center yourselves as we begin with an opening prayer today. Holy Spirit, name above names, you who have been called in times of wonder and despair, hear our prayer. Be that sustaining presence which holds us as we remember those we have loved and lost. Help us to honor and be faithful to the memory of those who, without consideration of the cost, gave the last full measure of service to humanity. Beloved one, comfort the grieving. We know that our sorrow and loss never ends, but transmute our pain. Help us to live more fully, more faithfully. Help us to honor their memory by exemplifying the best of what they offered to the world. May our lives also be in service to those who are hurting, those who are frightened and need our help. Protect the rescuers and the rescued. Guide their actions and guide ours. May we remember every day those who have touched our lives, earned our respect, and blessed the world. Holy Spirit, comfort and sustain us. We ask for peace in this lifetime, and that the peace of the eternal be upon those whom we have loved and remember now and forever. May it be so. Amen.
FDNY Chief Peter J. Gansey, Jr., age 54. FDNY Commissioner William M. Feehan, age 72. FDNY Marshal Ronald Paul Buca, age 47. FDNY Chaplain Michael Judge, age 68. Citywide Tour Commanders, Chief Gerard A. Barbara, age 53. Chief Donald J. Burns, age 61. Battalion 1, Chief Matthew Lancelot Ryan, age 54. Lieutenant Paul Thomas Mitchell, age 46. Battalion 2, Chief William McGovern, age 49. Chief Richard Prunty, age 57. Faustino Apostol, Jr., age 55. Battalion 4, Lieutenant Thomas O'Hagan, age 43. Battalion 6, Chief John P. Williamson, age 46. Battalion 7, Chief Oriel Palmer, age 45. Lieutenant Stephen G. Harrell, age 44. Lieutenant Philip Scott Petty, age 43. Battalion 8, Chief Thomas Patrick DeAngelis, age 51.
David Arce, 36. Michael Boyle, 37. Robert Evans, 36. Keithroy Marcellus Maynard, 30. Engine 37, John Giordano, 47. Engine 40, Lieutenant John F. Ginley, 37. Kevin Bracken, 37. Michael D. Diaria, 25. Bruce Gary, 51. Michael F. Lynch, 30. Stephen Mercado, 38. Engine 50, Robert W. Spear, Jr., 30. Engine 54, Paul John Gill, 34. Jose Guadalupe, 37. Leonard Raja Ilya, 36. Christopher Santora, 23. Engine 55, Lieutenant Peter L. Freund, 45. Robert Lane, 28. Christopher Mozillo, 27. Stephen P. Russell, 40. Engine 58, Lieutenant Robert B. Nagel, 55. Engine 74, Ruben D. Correa, 44. Engine 201, Lieutenant Paul Richard Martini, 37. Gregory Joseph Buck, 37.
New York City PD, Sergeant Timothy A. Roy, Sr., 36. Sergeant John Jared Coughlin, 43. Sergeant Rodney C. Gillis, 33. Sergeant Michael S. Curtin, 45. Detective Joseph V. Vigiano, 34. Detective Claude Daniel Richards, 46. Maria Ann Smith. Ramon Suarez, 45. Paul Talty, 40. Santos Valentin, Jr., 39. Walter E. Weaver, 30. Ronald Philip Klupfer, 39. Thomas M. LeJeune, 39. James Patrick Leahy, 38. Brian Grady McDonald, 38. John William Perry. Glenn Karen Pettit, 30. John D. Alara, 47. Vincent Dans, 38. Jerome M.P. Dominics, 37. Stephen P. Driscoll, 38. Mark Joseph Ellis, 26. Robert Fazio Jr., 41. Manuel Mojica, 37. Lawrence Vigio, 28. Keith Fairbairn, 24, a paramedic who worked for the New York Presbyterian Hospital. Richard Perlman, 18, an EMT who worked for the Forest Hills Volunteer Ambulance. Mario Santoro, 28, a paramedic who worked for the New York Presbyterian Medical Center. Yelmo Marino, 24, a single mother of an 8-year-old son who worked as an MT for MetroCare Montefiore Medical Center for 3 years. Mohammed Salam Hamandi, 23, Muslim American who worked as a part-time certified EMT, New York City Fire Department, also a member of the New York City Police Department Cadet Corps for 3 years. Mark Sullins, 30, an EMT who worked with Cabrini Medical Center. Mark Schwartz, 50, an EMT who worked for Hunter Ambulance. Jeff Simpson, and New York Fire Patrol Unit 2 Officer Keith Roma. Now that concludes the reading of the names of the victims of the 9/11, the first responders. As I said, 412. And when you hear those names and you hear those ages, you realize they were at the best times of their life, possibly, and probably with families. So we dedicate this ceremony to them, those unsung heroes, and their families. And we'd like to commemorate that right now with the pipe and drums. Topic of my talk is the importance of the grand jury. And as you may know, that there has never been, as far as we know, a criminal investigation resulting in a grand jury in this country. Reference to New York City, the evidence at New York City of pre-planted explosives and controlled demolition. Now, the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry submitted a grand jury petition in April 10th of last year, amended it in July 30th of last year. That was 54 pages. It had 57 exhibits. Those exhibits are dispositive, we like to say in legal jargon, of controlled demolition of bombs and incendiaries involved in bringing down the towers. We recently, Mick Harrison and myself, talked to the Chief of Terrorism, International Terrorism, Narcotics, Michael Ferreira, because we wanted to know what the progress was, because we had received in November a letter from the U.S. Attorney telling us he had read and reviewed the petition for a grand jury, that he acknowledged the law we cited, which was USC 18, USC 3332A, and that he would comply with the law, which mandates him, it's not discretionary, to call a special grand jury and present that evidence to the grand jury. So, not hearing anything, we have taken it upon ourselves to call them, and what we were told is they could not disclose anything to us because it was all in secret. All right, now our attorneys, and Mick Harrison will be briefly coming up here, he's a litigation director, and other attorneys, we looked into this, and there's case law that shows that we are entitled to certain things, and they call ministerial records and some substantive records. And so what we've done yesterday was filed, the Lawyers Committee, Richard Gage and others to be named, have filed a lawsuit against William Barr, U.S. Attorney, and Jeffrey Berman, the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District here in Manhattan. And it's a mandamus lawsuit. It basically says, do what you're supposed to do, convene the grand jury, and it also in part is a suit to disclose public records, because under common law we're entitled to those records, at least some of them, and under the First Amendment you have entitlement to those records also. So without getting into the particulars, to let you know that the Lawyers Committee has taken another step further to get a grand jury moving, all right? Now, in that grand jury was 57 exhibits. There are now 60, because a few days ago we submitted 3 new exhibits. One exhibit has to do with a resolution which Commissioner Gioia will talk about. Another exhibit has to do with a report from J. Leroy Halsey that Richard Gage will no doubt talk about. And the third exhibit is something that the Lawyers Committee has done. We've taken a transcript or a deposition over 2 hours of an operating engineer who worked in the towers, or who was familiar with the towers, who knew people that worked in the towers, and he received information that there was, quote, ghost crews or mystery crews coming in for 3 months prior to 9/11 on Saturday from midnight to 8 o'clock in the morning. They came into those buildings. They did not have to give any identification. They came in an unmarked van, left in an unmarked van. They had no ID on them, no identification on their logo, no logo. They were not required to sign in. They didn't have to log in. There was no work orders for them. There was no checks of insurance to cover whatever they were doing there. They were escorted into the building to the telecommunications room, which is adjacent to the elevators, adjacent to the central columns in the buildings. And we gave that report as an exhibit, Exhibit 60, to the U.S. Attorney to investigate what this gentleman said, this operating engineer, to start connecting the dots. So what we're announcing today to Lawyers Committee is that there is a lawsuit to force, well, hopefully be cooperative, to get a grand jury moving, and there's additional exhibits to give every reason why there should be an investigation. Never a criminal investigation. Now, when I say dispositive of controlled demolition, there's a lot of proofs. Some of them you'll see today, but maybe the strongest one to me, besides the nanothermite, it was a military explosive in the dust, etc., the high heat, the gravity fall, is the 155 first responders who said they experienced sounds and sights of explosives. And they were never called to the 9/11 Commission for a statement. We have their statements. If you go to lc4911.org, you can read the statements on our website. This is going to be a long process. It has been. We have to take it up another level. This is really a spiritual battle. We're in a church. We pray. And whatever evil is out there that's caused this, we want to address it. Good place to start is through prayer. Thank you. It's my great pleasure to introduce the former Marine and the fire commissioner in Franklin Square, Munson, and his fellow commissioners have just done an historic resolution and vote, and now are taking the lead to try to get some truth and integrity to an investigation to what happened on 9/11. I would like to introduce Commissioner Christopher Gioia.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you very much, David. Good afternoon, David and honored guests. My name is Christopher Gioia, and I'm a fire commissioner with the Franklin Square Munson Fire District in the town of Franklin Square, New York, Nassau County, which is near the Queens border. I'm a Marine Corps veteran, and I've been an active volunteer firefighter with the Franklin Square and Munson Fire Department for 33 years. I am also a former EMT and an ex-chief, having served 5 years in that position. I am currently employed as a construction surveyor with Local 15 operating engineers in New York City, having worked in the heavy construction industry for the past 30 years, specializing in reinforced concrete, major foundations, and structural steel. On the morning of September 11, 2001, I was working on the Brooklyn side of the East River, just north of the Williamsburg Bridge, and I had a spectacular view of Manhattan and the Twin Towers. Having been an eyewitness to the attacks that day, and from being called to duty to assist the Fire Department of New York in the following days and weeks afterwards, 9/11 has never been far from my thoughts, having been burned forever into my psyche. That night, as I lay in bed numb with shock and disbelief, a wicked lightning and thunderstorm descended on the town of Franklin Square. It was the kind of thunder that crashed and reverberated and shook the walls of the house down to the foundation. It was a bad storm, and I remember thinking that the heavens had opened up, and all that hatred and evil that was perpetrated that day was spilling out all around us, and that God was truly angry about this, and that this was an omen of things to come. Now, almost 18 years later, life is somewhat normal. The country is still at war with that faceless, nameless enemy that knows no territorial boundaries, yet manages to provoke this country into attacking sovereign nations without a formal declaration of war from Congress, or without any independently corroborated intelligence or information as to why a military intervention is justified or needed. Presently, when the Pentagon says our military must attack, who would dare question that? It's the all-encompassing and never-ending war on terror, and it stems from the attacks on 9/11, 2001. The 9/11 Commission concluded that Osama bin Laden and a group of Islamic terrorists were responsible and carried out the attacks, and that was to be the end of it. Truth be told, this is far from the end of it. The 9/11 Commission was flawed, and in the words of two of its own, the chairman and the vice chairman of the 9/11 Commission, respectively, Thomas Keane and Lee Hamilton, stated in their book, without precedent, that they were, quote, set up to fail, end quote, and were starved of funds to do a proper investigation. They also confirmed that they were denied access to the truth and misled by senior officials in the Pentagon and the Federal Aviation Authority, and that this obstruction and deception led them to contemplate slapping officials with criminal charges. The final report did not examine key evidence and neglected serious anomalies in the various accounts of what happened. The commissioners themselves admit their report was incomplete and flawed, and that many questions about the terror attacks remain unanswered. Nevertheless, the 9/11 Commission was swiftly closed down on August 21st, 2004. The failings of the official investigation have fueled too many half-baked conspiracy theories. Some of the 9/11 truth groups promote speculative hypotheses, ignore innocent explanations, cite non-expert sources, and jump to conclusions that are not proven by the known facts. They convert mere coincidence and circumstantial evidence into cast-iron proof. This is no way to debunk the obfuscations and evasions of the 9/11 report. But even amid the hype, some of these 9/11 groups raise valid and important questions that were never even considered, let alone answered by the official investigation. The bottom line here is that the American public has not been told the complete truth about the events of that fateful autumn morning almost 18 years ago. What happened on 9/11 is fundamentally important in its own right, but equally important is the way the 9/11 cover-up signifies an absence of democratic, transparent, and accountable government. Establishing the truth is, in part, about restoring honesty, trust, and confidence in the American political system. That is why, on July 24th of this year, the Franklin Square and Munson Fire Department voted unanimously to adopt a legal resolution of support for the special federal grand jury investigation before the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. The almost 3,000 innocent people who were murdered, right before our eyes that day cannot speak. So it is left up to us to speak for them and demand that their voices be heard in a court of law with subpoena power and an impartial jury to consider all the evidence by placing 9/11 under a microscope and investigating everything and anything with the same veracity as the recent Mueller investigation into Russian collusion. And not before some so-called commission of political appointees who had the rules dictated to them by some of the very people who were being investigated, or who had conflicts of interests, and which should have led to several members of the commission to recuse themselves. I demand to know, as should everyone, why was this important testimony limited, and in some cases not even recorded? Why was crucial evidence suppressed or not even considered and looked at, or worse yet, destroyed? That is not justice. To put 9/11 into a little perspective, I looked at the cost of government investigations and money spent. The Mueller investigation cost about $25 million. The Whitewater investigation cost about $60 to $70 million. The Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, it cost about $175 million and 7 astronauts killed. The Space Shuttle Columbia disaster cost about $400 million and 7 astronauts killed. The 9/11 Commission was initially given $3 million and 18 months to complete, with a final cost of about $15 million and a conclusion that it was a failure of imagination. Really, imagine that. The worst act of terrorism in the history of our country, which claimed almost 3,000 innocent lives and which dramatically altered the course of our nation and the world, and it had an imposed deadline of just 18 months, which was extended by 2 months, and it had an initial budget of just $3 million. Remember what the chairman and vice chairman of 9/11 Commission said. They were set up to fail and were starved of funds to do a proper investigation. Who could have imagined that, given the magnitude of such an atrocity? People lie, but the facts don't. All we want now, after 18 years, is the truth, based on the facts that can be proved in a court of law. Throughout history, it has been the inaction of those who could have acted, the indifference of those who should have known better, and the silence of the voice of justice when it mattered most, that has made it possible for evil to triumph. So it would seem now, until now, we have left unmolested those who set the fire to the house and prosecuted those who sounded the alarm. But that is changing. Justice consists not in being neutral between right and wrong, but in finding out the right and upholding it wherever found against wrong. Theodore Roosevelt. Justice will not be served until those who are unaffected are as outraged as those who are. Benjamin Franklin. And for all of you who have been toiling away in the kitchen, where's Richard Gage? Toiling away in the kitchen for these past 18 years, Confucius said, "The man who moves a mountain begins by carrying away small stones." Thank you.
Right. That was a wonderful talk. Our next speaker, Mick Harrison, is the litigation director of the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. And when I mentioned that we just submitted a new grand jury petition, Well, Mick is very instrumental in putting that together. He is a public interest lawyer for 27 years, experiencing litigating whistleblowing protection, environmental enforcement, constitutional rights, Native American rights, federal false claims rights. And if you're talking about people's freedom, Mick's the guy. We're honored that he's with the Lawyers Committee and our litigation director. I want to present Mick Harrison from Indiana.
Good afternoon, folks. David asked me to give you the short version of what legal actions we have in progress to build on this evidence you've been hearing about. So, is this any better? Okay, maybe my technical colleagues can help with the volume. So, as a former teacher, I don't normally have this problem of projecting. So the short version is the Lawyers Committee has 5 active federal lawsuits at this time, building on the evidence we're talking about. 3 of them are Freedom of Information Act lawsuits to help obtain records still in the hands of the federal government that the public has not seen yet. One of those lawsuits is against the FBI, and I'll give you the details on that. And the other is the lawsuit that David just mentioned, which is the mandamus lawsuit to force the U.S. Attorney to provide all of this demolition evidence to a special grand jury. And so these lawsuits are progressing. They're in different stages. The FBI lawsuit is regarding a commission that some of you may not know about. It's not the original 9/11 commission. It's regarding a later 9/11 review commission. And for those who don't know, that commission was mandated by Congress in 2013. It did its work in 2014 and 2015, issued a report in March 2015, and the Congress had ordered the FBI to do this new evaluation of all 9/11 evidence that had not been addressed by the original 9/11 commission. And there was a lot of 9/11 evidence that was not addressed by the original 9/11 commission. And all of the demolition evidence you've heard about today is among that evidence that was not addressed by the original 9/11 commission. So how much of the demolition evidence did the new 9/11 Review Commission address? And the answer is 0. They didn't look at any of it. They didn't even acknowledge that that body of evidence was out there. And there are a number of other categories of evidence that was not looked at by either commission. So the purpose of this lawsuit, currently in the U.S. District Court in Washington, D.C., is to get a court order directing the FBI to go back and do what Congress ordered them to do, which is to assess and report to Congress, and thereby to all of us, all of the 9/11 evidence not addressed by the original 9/11 Commission. And other categories briefly of that evidence, in addition to the controlled demolition evidence, there was a body of evidence regarding some individuals arrested on 9/11 under suspicious circumstances. The FBI calls them the high fivers. That evidence was not addressed by the new commission. The evidence of Saudi and other international financing for some of the alleged hijackers, not addressed by either commission. The evidence of the Pentagon videos, which we have yet to see, from the Pentagon and the surrounding areas, not addressed by either commission. The evidence of plane wreckage and parts recovered from the scenes of the 3 crashes, and most of you have seen the pictures of the FBI walking in lines across these crash areas, picking up evidence, every scrap of evidence they could find. That evidence has yet to be evaluated by either commission or reported to Congress or the public. And the other category we've addressed at the moment has to do with phone calls reportedly made from the planes on 9/11, and there's an issue, some of you may know about that. The FBI gave one description of those calls to the 9/11 Commission and another description of those calls to a federal court in the Moussaoui case. So that lawsuit is progressing, and we'll let you know how that goes. We have an inkling of what the government's response is going to be They filed initially a motion to dismiss, arguing legal technicalities, that we didn't have standing to even raise the issue, and that the congressional mandate wasn't really enforceable. We filed an amended complaint after that, which mooted their initial motion, so we'll be seeing that motion again shortly. The Freedom of Information Act cases we have pending, one is against NIST and FEMA for all of the building performance study data, and we actually acquired a lot of their records already because of that lawsuit, but there's more they're withholding. That case, the status of that case is we filed summary judgment motion, so it's the government. We're expecting a decision any moment on that case, and we'll let you know what happens on that. The government has basically taken the position that, notwithstanding records that we have that refer to these other records they have never provided, that they can't find the records that their own reports refer to. So we'll see how that works out. The second FOIA case is against NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology. We're trying to get the interviews that NIST investigators did with first responders, and those have yet to see the light of day. We hope they will soon because of our lawsuit. And the third Freedom of Information Act lawsuit is regarding column 79. You saw that mentioned by Richard. Column 79 is where NIST says the collapse of Building 7 started, and we're trying to get all the data regarding column 79, which we think will support the findings of the study just released by Professor Halsey from Alaska. So that is a significant lawsuit as well. The last lawsuit I'll talk about today is our mandamus lawsuit. Mandamus basically has to do with enforcing a mandatory duty. You may not realize all of us as citizens have a right to sue a public official who fails to perform a mandatory duty. And the duty in this case is the U.S. attorneys, imposed by a federal statute, as David mentioned, to hand any evidence from any of us of a federal crime reported to a U.S. attorney over to a special grand jury. The U.S. attorney has no discretion about this. It is a mandatory duty, must do. So we did get an encouraging sign, as David mentioned, from the U.S. attorney in the Southern District here in a letter saying they would comply with this statute. But they gave no details about what steps they would take to comply, and so we still don't know whether our petition and all of its evidence of controlled demolition has been given to a special grand jury. It may have been given to a special grand jury, and we're hoping for the best on that. But because the U.S. attorney, and as David mentioned, we called the assistant U.S. attorney, Michael Ferrara, who has the terrorism unit in the Southern District for the U.S. attorney, and his position was because of Federal Rule 6, Criminal Rule 6, he couldn't disclose any details to us, and so we're stuck having no way of knowing the status. And not being inclined to be stuck, we brought this federal lawsuit asking for two things. First, we're asking for a disclosure of certain records and information so that we can know that our petition evidence was actually handed to the special grand jury. If it was, that lawsuit will be over. We'll have accomplished that goal of getting all this evidence you're hearing about in front of 16 to 23 regular citizens to decide how to investigate it. And we hope that that is happening as we speak. However, if we don't get that disclosure ordered, or if we get a disclosure and the disclosure is the U.S. attorney has not actually given our evidence to the grand jury, then we're asking for a court order that the U.S. attorney be directed to give that evidence to a special grand jury. And so that lawsuit was filed yesterday, and we had the good help of a New York attorney, John O'Kelly, who may be here in the audience, and I thank him for having the courage and integrity that not all members of my profession have had on this issue, and we couldn't have done this without him. So thank you, John. Now, let me close to say that the evidence we presented of controlled demolition in these litigations is not just persuasive, it is, in our view as lawyers, dispositive, which means that the doubt has been removed about it. And a number of the categories of evidence standing alone are scientifically dispositive. And what that means is that they've eliminated all other potential explanations other than the use of explosives. And as Arthur Conan Doyle has said through his character, Sherlock Holmes, when you've eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. And that's where we're at on the controlled demolition issue, and we hope the courts at some point will come to grips with that. Now, a lot of my colleagues aren't here, or they're in various parts of the country and the world at the moment, and but we have a number of strong motivations for continuing our work, and I want to share one of them with you because it's related to the historic actions we've heard about from Commissioner Gioia and his colleagues, and that is, if you watch the video record of what happened on 9/11, you'll observe that one of the firefighters made his way up, pretty high up in one of the towers, and he reported back that the fires were, there weren't that many fires, they weren't that bad. A couple lines, couple hoses could knock them down, and shortly thereafter, and I do mean shortly thereafter, that building collapsed. And now that we know from this evidence that there were explosives placed in the buildings, that means that whoever triggered those explosives at a time that they knew that these courageous, selfless firefighters and first responders were in that building and that they were going to be killed when they triggered those explosives. And they did that knowingly. And, you have to sort of let that sink in. And so that is one of the motivations for me and why we're not going to stop until we do get transparency and accountability on 9/11. Thank you very much.
Okay, that was Mick Harrison, Litigation Director for the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. Our next speaker is very well known in the 9/11 community. He lost a son in the North Tower. He's a stalwart, an inspiration to everyone that's been involved with 9/11. I'd like to introduce from Philadelphia, Bob McIlvaine.
Okay, hello everyone. I decided to speak to you about my journey, utilizing a speech I gave a few years back on 9/11. All right, as you're all aware, we really lost a great literary icon, writer Toni Morrison. Bobby had a real connection with her. I can't believe how much I practice this. All right, taking every course of hers that he could while at Princeton. After Bobby died, she wrote to us, offering condolences and sending along a research paper of Bobby's that she had saved. My wife Helen, of course, moved by this gesture, wrote to Miss Morrison thanking her. Several months later, Helen found a copy of a very short, barely several lines long, autobiography Bobby had written as part of a work assignment. In it, Bobby listed Allen Iverson, great Philadelphia 76er, Toni Morrison, and his mother, Helen, as his favorite people. My wife immediately got off another note to Ms. Morrison, attaching the bio and adding, "Just wanted to know how much Bobby thought of you. I'm so excited that I made the cut." As Bobby's father, I'm not sure where I stood, hopefully in the top 10. I'm bringing up Toni Morrison for another reason. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm afraid of these buttons. I'm bringing up Toni Morrison for another reason. Since her death, there has been much written about her, often accompanied by a quote. One I read recently got to me in simplicity. Toni Morrison wrote, if there's a book that you want to read, okay, but if it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. To me, it means that if there's something If there's something that needs to be written, or something that needs solving, we don't wait for the other guy to look for the answers. We seek it ourselves. It's our responsibility to look for the truth, to embrace the task. Since 2001, the truth has not been written yet. It's our job, my job, to keep at it until it is. All right, connecting the dots of 9/11. Since Bobby's death of 9/11, I have been on a journey to find the truth and how and why he died, and who really killed him. I was not satisfied from the beginning with the official story of his death. I also feared that violence around the world would escalate as a result of this horrendous act. In 2002, I joined September 11th Family for Peaceful Tomorrows, a group of activists whose name was inspired by a Martin Luther King statement, wars are poor chisels for carving out peaceful tomorrows. In the early part of the new decade, we marched hand in hand for peace in Washington and New York, hoping that 9/11 would not be a justification for increased war efforts. I'll never forget the moment when we were arrested on the Capitol lawn, proudly carrying a banner stating, I was carrying a banner stating, "Not my son's name," which referred to the use of 9/11 by Bush for further war efforts. Later, at a World Conference on Victims of Violence in Bogota, Colombia, I told Bobby's story to a packed audience of survivors of various atrocities around the world. I was honored to have the opportunity to share my pain and grief with those who truly understood the price of violence. Back in the United States, I regularly attended 9/11 commission hearings, patiently listening to testimony, while hoping to find answers to an official story that continued to make little sense. Instead, I felt frustrated with the inability of the commission to discover anything new or enlightening. Witnesses, including Condoleezza Rice, were not accountable to the commission or the American people. Ms. Rice, to my dismay, filibustered her way through the entire commission. I returned home very discouraged. In 2005, on the 60th anniversary of the atomic bombing, I was asked to join Peaceful Tomorrows on a march from Nagasaki to Hiroshima, honoring those who had died in war. I walked beside the Hibakusha, survivors of the attack. They showed amazing pride, never taking the role of a victim, though many were treated as outcasts by their own people. The Hibakusha's courage impressed in me the need to continue my quest for peace and truth. I returned home deciding that the U.S. government was not going to give me the real answers to 9/11. Then I'd find them myself. Why, I wonder, why was it so hard to go against the government's version of a story that did not make sense? I wanted to know why the media always seemed as far from a free press as one could imagine, often ignoring obviously breakthroughs in information. Why also did peace seem either further away than before 9/11, frustrating the peace community? Our children died that horrible day, and it was now being used as fodder for more escalation, more deaths. My quest for truth took me to both the traditional history sources as well as books written by outstanding authors who questioned the company line and sought deeper answers than what was offered in the news or in press conferences. As I searched, I recalled quotes by Eisenhower, Kennedy, Roosevelt, and President Wilson, initially read years ago by me when their dire warnings meant very little to a young college student studying history. Eisenhower, in a famous speech in 1961, warned of the dangers of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. Kennedy, later that year, warned of a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. Fascinated with these predictions by such stellar leaders, I began to probe further, seeing patterns, taking a harder look at the circumstances leading to the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. I looked farther back in history, reading about Operation Gladio and the Gulf of Tonkin in a different, more knowledgeable way or light. Was the 9/11 another false flag? I was beginning to see the truth. I wondered if presidents truly had any power to wage peace, or special interest groups with unimaginable wealth and power, who were often referred to as a shadow government, controlling the decisions of war. After more continued research, I learned that these clandestine operatives would never allow control of a government to the people. They would instead rely on disinformation, weapons of mass destruction, a perfect example, fabrication of injustices, and the spreading of propaganda to justify their aggressive acts. Could these elite few be responsible for the upheaval in so many countries when it appeared to the general public that we were in those countries to promote democracy? As I continued my reading, I recalled a quote from Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister. You tell a big lie enough and keep repeating it, people eventually come to believe it. He went on to say that the truth is the mortal enemy of the lie, and thus, by extension, the truth is the greatest enemy of the state. Sadly, I came to the conclusion best said by Woodrow Wilson, and unfortunately true today. We have come to one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the civilized world. No longer a government of free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men. From hours and hours of research, I've learned that the truth of 9/11, as well as the truth regarding who really holds the power in this country and throughout the world, are not in our best interest to know. According to those elite few who choose to control our destiny, unfortunately, peace and truth are not part of that destiny. Thank you. I got through it. Thank you.